I want to talk about a growing problem in the anti-natalist community, one that stands to undermine everything that the philosophy claims to stand for. There are people within the anti-natalist community who have become spectators rather than active participants. They sit in the stands of the Colosseum, watching human suffering unfold like it's a blood sport, providing commentary and critique from a safe distance. But they're not gladiators in the arena fighting to reduce suffering. They're Roman citizens in the seats, eating grapes and demanding more entertainment. These spectators have found a peculiar form of amusement, using other people's pain as fodder for their intellectual exercise. When someone shares their suffering, these individuals don't respond with empathy or solidarity. Instead, they immediately launch into interrogation mode. Can you prove your suffering is legitimate? Let's examine the logical consistency of your personal narrative. Are you being intellectually rigorous enough about your own pain? The person sharing their story is essentially put on trial. They must defend the validity of their suffering to an audience that treats compassion as something that must be earned through philosophical performance. Only after passing this gauntlet of intellectual scrutiny might they receive a modicum of empathy. Their concern isn't to help anyone, it's to lure you into a debate. Think about what happens when you share your suffering and someone immediately challenges you. Suddenly, instead of processing your pain, instead of focusing on your own healing or advocating for change, you're defending yourself. You're spending your limited emotional energy trying to prove to a stranger that your suffering is real enough or valid enough or philosophically coherent enough. You end up defending yourself against someone else's opinion of you. And when you push back or refuse to engage, their excuse is always, well, you brought it up, as if sharing your experience is an invitation for interrogation, as if mentioning your suffering means you agree to a full cross examination, as if opening up about your pain is consent for someone to pick apart every detail of your story. The fact that you brought it up does not mean that you agree to a full interrogation. But let's be clear about what's happening here. There's a massive difference between sharing information and consenting to an interrogation. When someone shares their suffering in an anti-natalist space, they're doing one or more of the following. They're seeking solidarity from those who understand the imposition of life and the harm that it can cause, right? They're illustrating a philosophical point that procreation creates suffering without consent. They're attempting to process their trauma and what should be a supportive community, or they're attempting to connect with others who share similar experiences and perspectives. None of these purposes require or invite hostile cross examination. None of these are equivalent to saying, please spend the next 2 hours interrogating me about whether my suffering is real. Think about it in any other context. If someone is at a cancer support group and they mention their diagnosis, does the fact that they brought it up justify demanding that they prove that they actually have cancer? Does it justify that their medical records should be scrutinized? If a rape survivor shares their experience, does that mean that they have agreed to have their story picked apart to determine if they were really assaulted? What were they wearing? What did they do to bring it on themselves? If someone is at an AA meeting and they talk about their alcoholism, does the fact that they brought it up mean that they've consented to a debate about whether alcohol is really addictive? Of course not. In those contexts, we would understand that sharing is not an invitation to interrogate. We would understand that mentioning your experience does not mean you waive your right to basic human dignity and compassion. But somehow, in anti-natalist spaces, spectators have convinced themselves that you brought it up is a blank check to subject suffering people to hostile questioning. They've created a culture where sharing your pain is treated as an opening for prosecution. Sharing your experience is not a debate invitation. It's not a challenge for others to prove you wrong. It's not an open call for strangers to demand evidence and question your credibility. It's not consent to have your perception interrogated, your memory questioned, or your suffering minimized. When someone shares that they're in pain, you brought it up, it's not a justification for subjecting them to a hostile line of questioning. This is a deflection tactic, a way to make their cruelty your fault, to make you responsible for their callousness. It's how they avoid accountability for choosing to respond to suffering with interrogation instead of compassion. Most importantly, their opinion changes nothing. Their approval or disapproval doesn't alter your lived experience. Their acceptance or rejection of your story doesn't make your suffering any less real. Whether they validate you or dismiss you has zero impact on the actual conditions of your life. But while you're caught in their debate trap, something important is happening. You're being distracted from what actually matters. This is where the spectator's true purpose reveals itself. By pulling you into an endless debate about the minutiae of your personal story, they ensure you're not doing anything productive. You're not taking care of yourself. You're not connecting with people who actually support you. You're not organizing or advocating for change. You're not processing your trauma and you're not healing. You're just defending, justifying, explaining, and proving. To someone whose opinion is ultimately worthless because they've already decided the debate itself is more valuable than your own well being. Here's what these spectators fundamentally misunderstand: the veracity of someone's personal experience is not what is important. Personal stories only matter to the extent that they illustrate why the imposition of life is unethical. They're examples, not evidence requiring forensic examination. When someone shares their suffering, it is a demonstration of the harm that being born can cause, proof that procreation creates beings who will experience pain that they never consented to. That's it. That is the only relevance of these stories. Whether every detail of their story meets some arbitrary standard of proof is completely besides the point. Their suffering exists, the harm is real, the ethical problem remains. But there's an even more fundamental issue that these spectators miss. The person's perception is what matters. Even if the veracity of someone's story isn't completely accurate by some objective measure, their perception controls their reality. If a person doesn't enjoy their life based on their perception, then they simply don't enjoy their life, period. You can spend countless hours trying to prove to them that their circumstances aren't objectively as bad as they perceive. That doesn't mean that they're misremembering details. That's their interpretation of what they actually experience, which leads to the conclusion that their life and their experience is something that they don't want, and it's real regardless of what your opinion is. Like, they're the ones who are living their experience, so their perception is authoritative about the quality of their own life. Whether they prove to you that the veracity of their story is accurate doesn't change the fact that they do not enjoy their life and that they were harmed by being brought into existence. That is what matters for anti-natalism. Someone was brought into existence without their consent, and they are experiencing that existence as harmful and filled with suffering. That is the ethical problem. That is the violation. The rest is irrelevant noise. But here's what's happening when someone debates your lived experience in order to negate your actual suffering. They're actually making a case for why procreation isn't unethical. Think about it. When they pick apart your story, when they question whether your suffering is bad enough, when they suggest you're exaggerating or misremembering or not being intellectually rigorous, what they're really saying is your suffering isn't that bad. The imposition of life was not actually a harm. Therefore, creating new life is acceptable. They're undermining the fundamental premise of antinatalism itself. They're saying that the suffering caused by existence is debatable, negotiable, possibly not even real, which means procreation might not be wrong after all. These people are not antinatalists. They're making a case for pronatalism. They're using the language and framing it as anti-natalist, but they're actually arguing against its core principles. They claim to care about philosophical rigor, but what they're actually doing is providing intellectual cover for the continued creation of suffering beings. Consider how vegans approach animal liberation. They don't demand that each cow prove the precise degree of its suffering before declaring that factory farming should end. They don't get lost in endless debates about the subjective details of individual animals and their experiences at slaughter. Vegans are absolutists. Animals are being exploited and harmed. Therefore, animal exploitation must end. Case closed. No exceptions, no equivocations, no interrogations of whether this particular chicken's suffering meets the threshold for moral consideration. Why can't anti-natalists adopt this same absolutist stance about human suffering? Instead, we see endless exceptions, qualifications, and intellectual gatekeeping. We see a community that claims to care about eliminating human suffering, but seems more invested in demonstrating their own philosophical sophistication. We see people more committed to winning debates than ending human suffering. And what's worse, we see people actively working to minimize suffering, to suggest it's not as bad as people claim, to create wiggle room for the idea that maybe procreation is okay after all. Perhaps most troubling is how these spectators respond to people who feel they have been harmed by being born. When someone says, I didn't choose to exist and my life contains suffering I did not consent to, the response from these spectators is often, you're just a loser who couldn't win at the game of life. Think about how profoundly callous that is. You're telling someone they failed at a contest they never chose to enter. They were thrown into the arena without their consent, forced to fight opponents they didn't select, and now they're being mocked from the stands for not winning. It's like a gladiator being blamed for losing when they were captured and enslaved, forced into combat against their will. And the spectators sit safely in their seats, judging the performance of someone fighting for their life. But here's what the response really means. Life isn't actually harmful. You're just bad at it. The problem is you, not the imposition of existence. This is a direct rejection of anti-natalist ethics. It is a victim blaming approach. dressed as philosophical discourse. It's a way of saying that procreation isn't a problem, the people who suffer from it are. This is not compassion, this is cruelty in service of a pro-natalist worldview. Anti-natalism at its core is about taking suffering seriously, so seriously that we question the ethics of creating new human beings who will inevitably experience it. If you truly believe that, then your response to someone's suffering should be immediate compassion and a commitment to change, not a demand for receipts. You don't need someone to prove their pain with philosophical arguments. You don't need to verify every detail of their story. You don't need to interrogate whether their perception of their suffering is accurate. You need to recognize suffering when you see it and commit to the principle that we should be working to eliminate it, not perpetuate it. The movement should be focused on action, reducing suffering where it exists, preventing new sufferings from being created, and supporting those who are currently suffering, not on entertainment, not on debate for debate's sake, not on testing whether someone's pain is legitimate enough for our consideration, and definitely not on creating arguments that undermine the fundamental premise that procreation causes harm. Let me be direct about what's happening here. These spectators are too focused on themselves and their desire to spectate. It's more important that your story makes sense to them than actually helping you process your own trauma. They just don't care. And most tellingly, they need to make themselves part of your story. When you share your story, they can't just listen. They can't just let your story exist without inserting themselves into it. They have to they have to be the judge of who determines if your suffering is valid. They have to be the intellectual authority they have to be the intellectual authority who evaluates your logic. They have to be the referee who decides what counts and what doesn't count. They have to be the protagonist in a debate that they initiated. Your story has to make sense to them. It has to satisfy their curiosity. It has to meet their standards. You become a supporting character in their main story, which is about making them smart, them being right, them being entertained, them being engaged. It's not complicated. They just don't care. If someone actually cared about reducing suffering, their response to "I'm suffering" would be, how can we reduce this suffering? Or at a minimum, I hear you. Not prove it to me in a way that satisfies my intellectual curiosity. The fact that their first instinct is interrogation rather than compassion tells you everything. They don't actually care about your suffering. They care about their own experience of engagement with your suffering as a form of entertainment. They can't just let someone else's story exist. They have to inject themselves into it. Well, let me evaluate whether this story is true. Let me determine if this meets the standard. Let me play devil's advocate. It doesn't make sense to me, so let me interrogate you about it. Me, me, me. Your story is just raw material for their own narrative about being an intellectually rigorous thinker or a skilled debater or someone who asks the hard questions. They want to watch. They want to observe. They want to comment. They don't want to be affected, moved, or changed by what they're witnessing. They want to consume your pain like content. It's just like they're watching a movie. This is a form of entertainment. Actually helping would require them to stop being the center of attention, feeling uncomfortable emotions. It would require them to take action that doesn't benefit them. It would require them to accept that not everything is about their experience or their perspective. And they're not willing to do any of this. They came to watch. They want to make sure everyone knows that they're watching. Let me be clear. These people are not advancing the anti-natalist cause. Their primary concern is not ending human suffering. Their primary concern is their own entertainment, the stimulation they get from debate, from playing devil's advocate, from demonstrating their intellectual superiority. What's more, whether they realize it or not, they're actively working against anti-natalism. By minimizing suffering, by suggesting it needs to be proven and verified, by creating standards that suffering must meet before being taken seriously, they're providing intellectual ammunition for pro-natalists. They're saying, maybe life isn't so bad at all. Maybe the people who suffer are just exaggerating. Maybe their perception is wrong. Maybe the imposition of existence isn't actually harmful. If you can't extend basic empathy to someone sharing their pain, if your first instinct is to question rather than to comfort, if you need people to philosophically justify their suffering before you take it seriously, then you're not helping this movement. You're actively destroying it from within. We need anti-natalists who approach this philosophy with the same absolutist conviction that vegans bring to animal liberation. Humans suffer. Creating new humans creates new suffering. This is unethical. We should stop doing it. No exceptions, no equivocations, no demanding that each suffering person prove themselves worthy of our consideration. When someone shares their pain, the response should be, I hear you, your suffering matters. This is exactly why we believe what we believe. This is exactly why anti-natalism is so important. Not, let me examine whether your suffering meets my standards for legitimacy. No, let's debate the finer points of your personal narrative so I can determine whether your suffering was really that bad. Or maybe your perception is inaccurate and maybe you're not really suffering as much as you think. Maybe you're just a failure and life isn't actually the problem. The suffering exists in the person's lived experience. That's all we need to know. The entire foundation of the anti-natalist position. If you encounter these people, and you will, remember this, you don't owe them a debate. You don't owe them a defense about your own suffering. You don't owe them proof that your pain is real or valid or philosophically sound or that your perception is accurate. Their opinion of you changes nothing about your actual experience, nothing about what you've endured, nothing about what you need to heal. When someone tries to pull you into a debate about whether your suffering is legitimate, recognize it for what it is. It is an attempt to undermine the anti-natalist position itself. They're trying to create doubt about whether procreation actually causes harm. They're trying to suggest that maybe suffering isn't inevitable. Maybe it's just about a personal failure or misperception. Maybe creating new life isn't wrong after all. Don't engage. Your time and emotional labor are too valuable to waste on someone whose arguments, intentional or not, serve pro-natalist ends. Anti-natalism is not a spectator sport. It's not a gladiator arena where you sit comfortably in the stands watching others bleed for your entertainment. It's not an opportunity to demonstrate how clever you are while others fight for their lives. It is a serious philosophical position about reducing suffering in the world, built on the recognition that procreation imposes existence and inevitable suffering on beings who cannot consent. If you're not committed to that goal, if you're more interested in intellectual games than compassion, if you're more invested in questioning people's suffering than acknowledging it, if you're creating arguments that minimize harm and provide cover for procreation, then you're not an anti-natalist. You are a spectator in a coliseum cheering for blood. The movement doesn't need spectators in the stands who use suffering as entertainment. It doesn't need people who create elaborate philosophical frameworks for dismissing pain. It doesn't need anyone making excuses for why procreation might be acceptable after all. It needs people willing to make it needs people willing to take suffering seriously, to extend empathy freely, and to work towards a world with less suffering, starting with the decision to stop creating new beings who will inevitably suffer. And for those of you who are suffering, don't let these false allies distract you. Don't waste your energy defending yourself to people who are undermining the very philosophy that validates your experience. You're not a gladiator who exists to perform your pain for their entertainment. Your suffering is real. Your perception of your existence is your reality. The imposition of your existence was a harm. You did not consent to any of this. And that is all that matters. Their opinion changes nothing. Focus on what actually does. Your healing, your well being, and connecting with people who actually understand that procreation is the problem, not you.